he went to the cross, before he went to suffer. And it kind of falls in between what we looked at last week, where Jesus says, I'm going to be crucified, and then we see Judas betraying Jesus, or agreeing to betray Jesus. And that comes about as a result of today's passage, and as what he saw as a waste. A man, I was reading this week of a man who told his mother about a friend who had died and left 3 small children. And his mother sympathetically said, "Why couldn't it have been me? I'm 93 years old and she was so young. I've served the Lord all of my life and I'm ready to go." I've heard that very thing before. And he consoled his mom and he said, "Mom, God left you here on earth for a purpose. He must have something else that he wants to do with you." And she said, "Well, I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to do it." Sometimes we wonder about this life and how things transpire. But last week, we caught up with Jesus and his disciples, and things were starting to heat up. They were starting to get closer to Jerusalem all the time. And he knew that as he entered into Jerusalem, that his life was going to end. He warned his disciples about this, as we saw last week in Matthew 26, verse 2. He said, "As you know, the Passover is in 2 days, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." At the same time, the chief priests and the elders, well, they've gathered in the palace of Caiaphas. And they're making plans to arrest Jesus and to have him killed. You see, Jesus, as we looked at last week, is in the midst of a great battle. And the stage is being set for Jesus' sacrifice of his very life. However, in between these 2 passages, we have this extravagant love. We have love's extravagance, where we see in Matthew 26, verses 6 and 7. It says, "While Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table." You see, Mary took the most precious thing that she had. She took that which was worth more than a year's wage. I can't imagine that. Something that would be worth so much, she took it and she poured it over Jesus. In stark contrast to that, the Sanhedrin, Mary's extravagance reflects loving worship. However, their reaction shows us hateful rejection. The Sanhedrin don't want Jesus to be around anymore. They see him as a threat, as someone that's threatening their position, their power, their prestige. And so they want to get rid of him. And so Jesus and his disciples, they're taking a break. And they're at the home of Simon the leper, it says. And it's believed, actually, that he used to be a leper, that he was no longer a leper, that it's possible that Jesus might have actually been the reason why he doesn't have leprosy anymore, that he had healed him. And Simon had invited him over to his house. You know, it's possible that he had been reunited with his family and was sitting there reclining at the table. And from John's Gospel, we learn that Mary and Martha and Lazarus were also there. This would have been after Lazarus had been raised from the dead. They were at Simon's house. They were reclining for a meal. And it says in John's Gospel that actually Martha was the one who was serving the meal. She had prepared the meal. She was serving the meal. As we know, we've read before, Martha's always on duty, ready to serve, ready to do things. And during supper, Matthew says that a woman came and poured the alabaster jar of perfume on Jesus' head. And Jesus tells us that the lady, John tells us that this lady is Mary. And from Mark's Gospel, we learn that the very expensive perfume, as it says, was worth over 300 denarii, which is equal to a year's wage for a common laborer or a soldier. It was an extravagant gift. It was beyond measure. As I asked the children, have you ever received a gift beyond measure? Something so extravagant that you just didn't expect. When Tracy and I were in New Harbor, Tracy had designed 4 different Christmas cards. And we went into Antigonish to a printer by the name, the printer's name was, the business was called The Casket, okay? And we went into The Casket to get these Christmas cards printed. And we got them printed, and we asked them about the bill, and they said, yep, the bill will be in the mail, it'll be coming. Okay, great. And so this was Christmas. And then in February, we had received and accepted a call to go to Newcastle, New Brunswick, to be the youth pastor there. And so we have this outstanding bill that was from November, or I guess we got it done in September the year before. And so February, I called them up and I said, we're looking for our bill. Yep, it'll be in the mail, it'll be in the mail. Great. Another month passes, no bill. I call them up, I'm still looking for my bill. Yep, it's going to be in the mail, it's going to be in the mail. Well, we were moving the 1st of May. And so in April, I said, that's that. We're going into the casket, and we're going to pay this bill, whether they want to or they want it or not. And so we walked in and we talked. We came up to the lady and we said to her, we're here to pay our bill for some Christmas cards that we got last year in September. She said, oh, yeah. We found that bill last week, and, well, we ripped it up and we threw it away. What? What are you saying? You don't have to pay it. That was part of last year's, business, and we can't charge you this year for last year's business, so it's paid. It's done. I walked out of there flabbergasted. Deflated even, because I walked in there ready to pay them, whether they wanted to be paid or not, and they just forgave me of my debt. It was an extravagant gift that we didn't expect. Here, Mary came to Jesus with an extravagant gift, one that she wanted to give to her Lord, her Master. This fellow by the name of Stu Weber. He's a pastor and an author, and in the book, or the magazine, the Leadership magazine, he shares this story. He says, my youngest son is the 3rd of 3 boys. The first 2 are high-powered, he said. The 3rd is not any less high-powered, but he's the 3rd out of 3. By the time you've had a brother who's all-conference this, and then another brother who's all-conference that, there's not much left to do. And so as a father, I worried about our caboose. He's the most sensitive of the 3. To encourage him, I spent a lot of time with him in the outdoors, camping, hunting, fishing. And anybody who has spent any time in the outdoors knows that a pocket knife is essential. It is part of the gear that you need to have. And the man with the best blade gets the job done. So, whenever you're setting up camp, you're always looking for the knife, of course. And so my son Ryan had the pocket knife. That became his identity. His older brothers always had to ask him to use his knife as we were setting up camp. That became his status in our tribe. He was the man with the blade. Well, my birthday came around one year, and my family was planning a party for me. And earlier in the afternoon, my youngest son, Ryan, the man with the blade, walked into my office at home, where I was studying. At first, I didn't hear him. I felt him. I could sense his presence, and I turned around. He had chosen this moment because he wanted to give me a birthday present. But not at the birthday party. He wanted it to be just me and him. And he handed me a present, and I opened it. And in it was his knife. His most precious possession. His identity. He was giving it to me. in this act of extravagant love. It seems Mary understood the significance of Jesus' impending death, and that Jesus had to die in order to be raised again. She had heard this. He'd already told them at least 3 times. In this act, we see that she understood that Jesus had not come to establish an earthly kingdom. However, it seems like the disciples are still expecting that as they're heading into Jerusalem. In this act, we see that she understood. And so she anoints Jesus for his sacrifice. She gets him ready. And in this act of extravagant love, we see her love, we see her honor as she pours out in worship, being controlled by her love for Jesus. You see, Mary did not offer this valuable possession to support the ministry, to be sold so that they could give the money away, but she offered it to Jesus himself. She did not seek any recognition from this. She didn't want her status to go up. She was generous, without hesitation, to offer her most valuable earthly possession in an act of worship, in an act of love and adoration. So a question I have for you is, what can you offer to Jesus? What is it that he may be asking you for? It could be going deeper with him, trusting in him more, relying on him, or giving more of yourself to him in greater ways each day. Then we have this response. The disciples, they're indignant, it says in Matthew 26:8. It says, when the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste? They asked. You see, the disciples had no idea what was really going on here. They were insensitive because they did not understand. And as we see in John's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 4 to 6, it says, but one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. You know, he did not say this because he cared about the poor more than the other disciples or more than Jesus. He said this because he was a thief. He was the keeper of the money bag. He used to help himself to what was put into it. Think of that. A year's wage. How much would he skim off the top? How much would he put into his pocket to put towards his extravagance, to put towards his whatever he wanted? The indignant response was instigated by Judas. And as we see from this passage in John, the money would not have really benefited the poor a whole lot. And this waste, as he saw it, just added fuel to the fire that I'm sure had been burning in his heart for some time. But this was the trigger. And from that very event, he left from the meal and he went to Caiaphas' home when the meeting was happening at the same time, and he agreed to betray. He agreed to betray his Lord and his master. He shows up and he asks, what are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you? These guys, they love this. They're wondering, how are we going to get him? Well, here it is on a silver platter right there. And as I told you last week, it was 30 pieces of silver, the very price of a slave. And so for the price of a slave, Judas was willing to sell his teacher, his leader, his friend, and to portray the very Son of God who had come to be the Savior of the world. And so to the indignation we see, they say in Matthew 26:9, that this perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor, which goes along with the parable that Jesus had told them just before this in the Gospel in chapter 25, where a few weeks ago I taught you about the sheep and the goats. For we saw that Jesus taught them that meeting the physical needs of his people is of the utmost importance. And Jesus says this is a mark of salvation. But Jesus' earthly ministry was going to come to an end very soon. And he was going to return to the Father. And as Jesus told them before that, he would suffer. He would die, and he would be raised up. So this was not the time for giving to the poor. It was a time to love Jesus. It was a time for charity. It wasn't a time for charity. It was a time for worship. As Jesus said in Matthew 26, verse 11, the poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. And Mary had chosen to do, as Jesus said, a beautiful thing. John MacArthur, he says this about this passage. He says, genuine worship is the best thing that we can give to Christ. There's a time for ministering to the poor, the sick, the naked, and the imprisoned. There is a time for witnessing to the lost and seeking to lead them to the Savior. There's a time for discipling new believers and helping people to grow in the faith. There is a time for careful study and teaching of God's Word. But above all else, that the Lord requires of his people is their true worship, without which everything else they may do in his name is empty and powerless. How is it that Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 13? Without love, it's a clanging cymbal, or without love, without worship, really, without worshiping, it's nothing. And so here we see what the Lord requires, true worship. And Jesus said it well in Matthew 22, verses 37 and 38. He said, love the Lord your God with all of your, read this with me, with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. To worship. It's to love God first and foremost, to worship him. And that's what Mary did in this extravagant gift. She worshipped. She gave. A fellow by the name of Jack Kelly, he worked for the USA Today at one time, and he was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. And he tells this story. He says, we were in Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia in East Africa. And during a famine, it was so bad, we walked into one village and everybody, it seemed, was dead in the village. There was a stench of death that gets into the air, gets into your hair, gets onto your skin, gets onto your clothes, and you just can't wash it off. He says, we saw this little boy. You could tell he had worms and was malnourished. His stomach, as you've seen probably, was protruding. And when a child is extremely malnourished, their hair turns reddish color and the skin becomes crinkled as though he's 100 years old. Our photographer had a grapefruit, which he gave to the boy. The boy was so weak he didn't have the strength to hold the grapefruit, so we cut it in half and gave it to him. He gained the strength to pick up the half. He looked at us as if to say thank you, and he began to walk back towards the village. We walked behind him in a way that he couldn't see us, and when he entered the village, there on the ground was a little boy who I had passed by earlier and thought was dead. His eyes were completely glazed over. It turned out that this was his younger brother. The older brother kneeled down next to his younger brother. He bit off a piece of the grapefruit. He chewed it. Then he opened up his brother's younger brother's mouth. He put the grapefruit in, and he worked his brother's jaws up and down so that he could eat it. And we learned that the older brother had been doing this for the younger brother for 2 weeks. A couple of days later, we found out that the older brother had died of malnutrition. However, the younger brother lived. And I remember driving home that night thinking, I wonder if this is what Jesus meant when he said, there is no greater love than to lay down our life for somebody else. See, Jesus had already told them, I'm going to lay down my life. Mary, in her extravagant gift, was laying down her life in a significant way. In 1 John 3:16-18, it says this. It says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. You see, Mary was laying down her life and giving her all to the Jesus whom she loved. In an act of worship to her Lord and Master. And Jesus knew this, and so Jesus stands up for her. What a waste, they said. In Matthew 26:10 and then 12 and 13, it says, aware of this, Jesus said to them, why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly I tell you, whatever or wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. You know the amazing thing? There's 4 gospels, and this story is in 3 of the 4. Our God, who inspired the authors, wanted this to be known. It had to be told. And here I am, 2,000 years later, preaching on this passage, the one that Jesus said, it will be told in memory of her. And why? Because she gave. She worshiped. She gave her all, a generous gift. She was giving unselfishly, sacrificial love and adoration. And so in closing, I have a question for you. And that question is, how can you grow deeper in your love for Jesus today, tomorrow, and into this week? How can you give more to Jesus and to grow deeper in